Okay, aber vielleicht ein Bild, ja nicht.
Nee, wir haben noch fünf. So, ja, es funktioniert. Es ist sogar ein bisschen laut. So, ich hoffe, so versteht man mich auch im Chat. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich zu unserer nächsten Sitzung heute mit den Feldern Digital Humanities und Kunstgeschichte. A warm welcome to Maria Wager. She is a professor at the Institute of Austrian History. At the Department of History, yes. It's something, a complicated structure. And her most important research focus is digital humanities, and what she's doing with digital humanities, we will learn later. She's also working on the Middle Ages, material cultures in the Middle Ages, and Christianization in Europe, and works with GIS analysis in archaeological data, to analyze archaeological data and socioeconomic processes. Thank you very much for coming. And I switched to English because Maria will talk in English, but the presentation will be in German and English, and you can ask in English or German. So deswegen gehe ich jetzt wieder zu Deutsch über, dass Sie sich wirklich motiviert fühlen, auf Deutsch und auf Englisch zu fragen. Sollte es Verständigungsschwierigkeiten geben, kommen wir sicherlich klar. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation and introduction. I'm super happy to be here, and I'm very echoey. Is it just for me or for you guys too? Can you understand it well? Yeah, I will take it as it's good. So I'm super happy to be here representing digital humanities and talking to you about what is digital humanities, how it came to be, and so on and so forth. I think you are so lucky to start your studies now when we are living in this digital age, because the possibilities are endless, which can of course be also quite confusing sometimes. But I honestly think that while we have much more challenges than before, because we need to process so much more information than before, it ultimately gives you much more opportunities as well. But when we are thinking about when it all started and how it all started, then probably the first image that comes to your mind would not be something that you can see on the screen. However, digital humanities is not a new thing. It's not something that just started in the 2000s or a little bit before. As long as we have computers, we have the endeavor to use that for humanities research. So what you see on the image is, I think, a fantastic thing. And as a medievalist, I also love that the whole thing is connected to a Jesuit priest called Father Bussa, who actually wanted to know more about Thomas Aquinas. And in the mid-20th century, he convinced IBM to create a massive concordance of the writings of Thomas Aquinas. So it was a project that involved encoding around 9 million Latin words, and they used punch cards. And I also want to point out that all the people that you see on this picture are women, because Father Bussa is a Jesuit scholar, an Italian Jesuit scholar. He also was promoting including women in these processes. So it was actually women who were doing his punch cards. And they used IBM's tabulating machines to sort and index them. This was a super ambitious effort. It took over 30 years to complete. And this is very, very often marked as the first humanities computing project. And we are in the 1950s. So very, very far from today and very well before the age of digital computers. Now, not surprisingly, after these things have started to get traction, things that did not go immediately into the super complicated things that we can do now. Partially also because technology was not there. So instead of digital humanities, first, these kind of endeavors were labeled as humanities computing projects. And I think these punch cards and the early computers that you can imagine, I'm sure, although you are very young and you have been born into a very, very digital age, at least most of you. I remember the first computers, well, not the first computers, but at least some from the 80s, which looked very, very different to the ones like now. But nevertheless, after the 50s to the 70s, researchers used these mainframes to perform tasks like generating word indexes, so concordances, or statistical text analysis, for example. And not surprisingly, this sort of statistical text analysis is one of the earliest and still most developed field of the age. But we're going to come back to that in a moment. And of course, it's not just the initiatives that took place, but actually centers were established to perform such works and collect people who are interested in humanities and can be thinking in a computational way as well to collect and connect the two. So once these networks were set up from the 60s onwards, as I said, these mainframe computers were used for text concordancing, corpus analysis, and other kind of computer-assisted evaluations. And the centers, together with these developing methodologies, have basically created the foundation of the development of DH as we know it today. So I think it's really nicely shows that from the very, very beginning, computers were used for humanistic ends, for humanistic means. So I think it's almost philosophical, almost really nice. Like when you think about it, how science came to be, philosophy and mathematics, humanities, and later natural sciences, they used to be very, very close together. And I feel like that now we are in an age when this is happening again. And this is something really fantastic, I think. So this has been developing in the 20th century. And as we stepped into the 21st, from the early 2000s, we received a new term, and that was digital humanities instead of humanities computing. And why it came into use was to kind of encompass a broader and more collaborative domain. So the focus kind of have shifted, which is really nicely seen in the name as well, because digital humanities, as it is today, is not only uses technology in humanities research, but it also examines technology critically through the lenses of a humanistic understanding. So this is really a two-way relationship, right? Because we are applying digital tools to humanities questions, and then we are questioning technology from a humanities perspective. Why? Because we could not perform the analysis. So the digital, we could not apply the digital tools to humanities questions without questioning those tools, right? and the results of it. Otherwise, it's not humanities research. Otherwise, it's pushing down buttons and taking the results out. But this two-way thing of using it, questioning it, analyzing with it, and then interpret and analyze and question the results, that's what makes digital humanities digital humanities. And that's what makes it so incredibly exciting. Nonetheless, I have to say that this kind of approach was already present in the very beginning, even in Father Busa's work. And this has been something fundamental and continuous in digital humanities identity. Okay. So if we want to think about what is exactly digital humanities, we went through like how it came to be and what are the fundamentals and so on and so forth. So in the middle, on the bottom of the slide, sorry, I forgot that I had to give the slides into computers. So if you go into the middle of the slide in the bottom, there's a website. If you want to, you can go on it right now. It is whatisdigitalhumanities.com. I find it really funny. So this is a website which is collecting quotes from researchers in the field of digital humanities from various digital humanities conferences over, I don't want to say anything stupid, but like 10 years or so, something like that. And everybody gives their own definition to what is digital humanities. Of course, there are very much similarities in it, but they all differ. And you can just open the website, it's going to give you a random definition. And if you refresh, it's going to give you another one. So I think this is really nice. What we can say for sure is that DH is an area of scholarly activity, let's say, that is merging humanities questions and computing tools and techniques. Okay? Now, how we are exactly phrasing this or how we are kind of turning it a little bit depends a lot on our expertise. Why? Because digital humanities is not one single discipline. Would you be able to say that humanities is one single discipline? Right? So how could digital humanities be one single discipline? It is not. It is a meeting point. It is a meeting point where various branches of humanities cross paths because of the digital tools and techniques that they are using. You can find historians, literary scholars, linguists, art historians, archaeologists, anything that you can imagine from the field of humanities who are having the same kind of vision. They want to explore data connected to the humanities in new ways. So we briefly said that early on, digital humanities was about creating digital archives and simple tools, humanities computing tools, right? But over the decades, it has grown tremendously. Of course, this is partially because of the development of computer science as well. Computer science now is very, very different from computer science in the 80s. Therefore, DH today is really often described as some sort of an umbrella or an umbrella term under which you are going to find everything from text analysis to digital mapping to 3D modeling of artifacts or cultural analytics or even studies on, for example, social media or gaming. So the most important characteristic of digital humanities is that digital humanities is interdisciplinary. At minimum, it's multidisciplinary, but at its best, it's interdisciplinary. Okay? It has all these insights from literature, history, musicology, archaeology, media studies, computer science, library science, anything really, and combining them into new frameworks. What is really, really cool in digital humanities is that while you're doing that, it also prompts you to recognize approaches, patterns, methodologies that can be applied into multiple disciplines as well. So, for example, this is how you would find out that somebody who is dealing with literally analysis of text can have something in common with someone who's researching the landscape. And I think this is really, really nice. So besides this, of course, we shouldn't forget about the most recent developments, which is machine learning, data science, and AI, which is up and coming in the DH toolkit, but not something that hasn't been foreseen by earlier researchers of digital humanities, who really recognized that computation would become central to humanities research. And another key trait of digital humanities comes from all of what we have discussed. And this is my favorite thing about this discipline. This is why I think that digital humanities is one of the greatest fields of humanities to be working in, because digital humanities is open and it's collaborative. Okay? So when you think about the stereotypical humanities scholars, they are usually working alone with their sources. I don't want to feed into stereotypes, but I think I probably don't need to. Digital humanities is teamwork. And I really believe in teamwork is dreamwork. So the more brains you can bring together in today's era, the better your results are going to be. And digital humanities is all about this. The projects are mostly involve teams with different people with different expertise. And also, which is really important, they do outputs, for example, data or even tools that are accessible openly. So open access is super duper important. Therefore, DH is also able to cultivate this two-way relationship between humanities and tech. And we use these digital tools to investigate culture, of course. So for example, mining a text corpus for teams. But we also critically examine how technology affects society and culture. Now, in other words, digital humanities is both applied and critical. And therefore, this is this dual nature that makes digital humanities innovative and also relevant. Okay? So, I thought that I would spend the rest of my time to, no worries, this happens. The rest of my time to go into the like main fields of digital humanities. And I thought that I would bring you pictures and I will ask you to guess the fields to make this a little bit more interactive. So the first picture is this. What can you recognize on this image? Other than I'm a bit of a nerd. Yeah? Yeah? Actually, that's what it does.
Repeat it because
Yes, of course. So your colleague have pointed out that it analyzes the text from Tolkien's The Hobbit. And that's exactly what it does. This is an open source tool called Voyant tool. I put the link for it for you, so you're going to be able to find it. And what I did, I just uploaded a PDF of The Hobbit to it. And what you can see is basically a word cloud, frequency, trends, and some visualizations of the analysis of the words in The Hobbit. And so no wonder you kind of figured it out that the first branch of digital humanities that we are going to talk about is text analysis and stylometrics. So, as we discussed, no surprise that people started with text as our favorite Jesuit priest that we talked about, with Thomas Aquinas. Because one of the major branch of digital humanities is computational text analysis. Why do you think digital humanities can add so much to that? Yeah?
I mean, it's kind of difficult to analyze text, especially because it takes a lot of time. So with the help of technical support and digital tools, you can analyze large amounts of text at the same time, much faster, and also more careful in a way. Exactly, and it's more comparative.
Absolutely. So text analysis and also stylometry is not something that happened from out of the blue. These things have existed. But as you said, the volume is really, really different. So instead of reading one book at a time, what we can do now is that we can use algorithms to read thousands of texts and detect patterns in them. And here comes, I think, one of the most important, if not the most important, although of course this is completely subjective, phrase in or term in digital humanities by Franco Moretti, which is called distant reading. Distant reading encompasses this approach when you're understanding literature by aggregating and analyzing large collections of text rather than creating of close readings of shorter or less complex texts. So is that clear for you? What's the difference between close reading and distant reading, right? So imagine, like, I'm going to tell you an example. Imagine, let's keep in the field of medieval studies. Imagine that you're reading a chronicle. And when you are creating a close reading of the chronicle, then you are working with one single text, maybe one chapter of the text even, and you're trying to figure out, for example, what kind of different hands you're able to recognize in that text. Maybe you're trying to figure out how many versions of this text might have been existed before, and you're creating this stylometric analysis, for example, word analysis, trying to map out the development of that one single text. This is close reading. Distant reading would be if we would be so lucky, of course we're not, but let's go into an imaginary scenario. You have 100 different versions of the same chronicle. You bring them all into one framework and you compare all of these patterns in them. That is distant reading. You're not going to get the same type of qualitative analysis that you get from the close reading, but you can process a much larger amount of data and you can still create a quantitative analysis on them. So you can focus on certain patterns, certain words, certain relationships that you want to recognize in it. and then work it on a much larger text corpora. And why I think that this is the cornerstone of digital humanities, because this is coming from a literary humanities. I am an archaeologist and a medievalist, and I do spatial humanities. And I think that this approach is one of the most important things in my research as well. Okay? Yeah? Sorry.
I have a question that maybe leads a bit further, but in recent times, we've seen, you mentioned algorithms, and in recent times, we've seen that by the US government with Project 2025, a list was published with words that should not be used and should not be funded when used in scientific research. And I think most of us know that these word lists are like, they contain words like women, the elderly, and just all over the place words that are very important in our language and in our research. How does digital humanities as a field, what are the discussion lines regarding those changes? How is digital humanities affected by those changes? Because I can imagine that it's a field that's majorly affected by those.
That is a very interesting question. And yes, it leads a little bit far, especially from the distance reading. But I would say that in any kind of humanities research, I think you can't detach yourself from the world, because what we're doing is a reflection on it. As a historian, I feel especially like that. It doesn't matter that you're dealing with medieval history, right? Or you're dealing with contemporary history, because it all has relevance to our life. We are all humans and we are repeating patterns. And I think what digital humanities can do is to counteract these movements in a way that we can analyze data, so let's say that when you're talking about populistic statements can be very easily rebuffed, very often. And I think digital humanities is a really good tool to do that, because we have so much data that we can work with that we can easily rebuff this kind of statements. You have to be clever, of course, and figure out a way how you want to point out the weaknesses of certain arguments and so on. But it absolutely can be used with a distant reading of a large corpora that can be, for example, used against such populistic views. Okay, so let's come back to a little bit to text analysis and stylometry. So what we are doing mostly is that when we are aggregating and analyzing these large collections of text, instead of closely reading a few, we can, with digital tools, for example, chart how often themes or certain words appear in different centuries even. So if we are working on a larger chronological framework, and we can even cluster, for example, stylistic similarities. This tool that I've shown you, this Voyant tool, is a really popular platform, and you can use it yourself because it's really quite easy to use. Of course, you need to learn how to interpret it, but you can just upload a text or a corpus of text, and you can get instant statistics, just like you have seen on my previous slides, where you would get frequency in the words, keyword displays, trend graphs, and such things. So you can get a really quick overview of any kind of textual patterns on something that you're working on. For example, even also which characters would be central in a novel, or how sentiments are changing in a chapter. And that kind of brings us to stylometry, connected to text analysis, which is the science of measuring literary style. So what stylometry does is it quantifies features, for example, word usage or sentence length, to capture the unique style of an author. the key idea is that every author subconsciously, totally subconsciously, leaves a statistical signature in how they write. And that is what is called a stylome. And you can totally compare these features. And therefore, you can figure out whether two texts have the same author. And this works in historical texts as well as in modern ones. For example, this is how they identified the novel that Rowling wrote under a pen name. And in these days, stylometry is, of course, aided greatly by various kind of digital humanities software. There is one of the most common ones is the R package called Stylo. And of course, it is continuously being refined. And what you need to understand here is that these patterns, while understood by the computer or investigated and analyzed by the computer, how we want to recognize them is designed by humans. Okay, so this kind of interaction between digital stylometric analysis and the basics of stylometry and how we actually recognize the stylistic fingerprint of an author remains in the field in humanities. So a lot of fun can be made with this. There is an example that I really like, which is coming from a guy called Ted Underwood, who's dealing with digital literary scholarship. Him and his team collected over 100,000 English language novels from the 1700s to the 2000s. And what they were investigating is that how gender is represented in fiction over time. And a really kind of massive paradox came out of the whole thing. So with this kind of distant reading of this corpus, focusing on gender, what they have seen is that despite of the obvious social progress of the social status of women, what they saw is that the proportion of female characters and also authors of novels actually declined in the 20th century compared to the 19th century. So these are the kind of insights that you can get with the distant reading of large corpora, which you really would not guess by yourself, because if you put it into the social context, it's completely contrary to what we know. So digital text analysis does not replace traditional interpretation, but what it does, it points to new questions. So if we want to sum it up, then what we can say is that text analysis and stylometry in the age enables, just a moment, both a macro level view and also a micro level detection of this kind of stylistic DNA, so that you can understand more of the history and the authorship of these texts. Yes?
I have a question to this distant reading. And with this example you made, because I have read books, for example, about sexuality, and in the whole book, never the word sexuality or sex is even there, or about gender, and also in this book, never there is written the word gender, or maybe also not woman. So yeah. Now I have the question: when you get the result from this, how you can prove it? Because you cannot go there and read all these texts and then say, okay, but they say this program didn't recognize also in this and this and this book. It's about, you know what I mean? How can we rely on this statistic?
I love this question because this actually points to exactly what we have been discussing. You're questioning the methodology of the digital analysis. And this is what the age is about, because even with the rise of machine learning and AI and all these kind of things, as we have discussed, we are the ones who design the analysis, right? It's humanities scholars who decide on how to recognize gender. Now, I think since it's specifically going on English language novels, there are ways to do this. You can work with names, you can work with pronouns, for example, and that is one way to recognize it. I don't know all the ways that they are using in this project because I'm not an expert in this, but what is really, really important here, and in any kind of research, is that you explain, especially for these sort of questions of how you designed your research and what you involved in it. So you can do it because you can say that you're going to include all the references to female names. You're going to include all the references to pronouns. Then you're going to compare, I don't know, the quantity of female pronouns to male pronouns and the female names to male names. So that's one possibility. And then you see, like, if we have like, I don't know, 20 people appearing in a novel, and out of the 20, 8 have female names and 12 have male names. So that is a possibility. But of course, there can be underlying things that are left out. This is statistics. Any kind of statistics, like everybody knows this from the polling before voting, right? Statistics can be tempered. And therefore, never ever believe any kind of research that does not describe you how it exactly came to the conclusion and what kind of base characters or base data it used. Very good question. Okay, so I think we need to move on to the next one because there's quite a few more and I want to discuss them all. So any guess of what this might be? Does the name Faust Edition gives you a hint? Faust? Yeah. Yes, it is Faust from Goethe. So this is a critical edition of Faust. And for more, this is a digital critical edition of Faust. Who knows what is a critical edition is? Okay, then we start there. So when we have different manuscripts or we have different texts that are evolving over time, then you can create critical editions where you track these sort of things and you add comments to it. You can imagine, for example, a corpus of medieval charters that are published. And you have all the comments in it, you have the footnotes in it, and so on and so forth. You have the various kind of explanations for abbreviations in the text, and so on and so forth. So these all come into the realm of critical editions. Now, where you can do this a little bit, I think, better are the digital critical editions. Why? Because these are normally printed books, printed texts, where you have one text and then you have the markup on it and the comments on it and the explanations on it. Now, instead of one, we can collect them all. And Faust is a really, really nice example for this. In the digital realm, you can create these editions as dynamic websites, which, for example, not only have the printed text, right, that we had before from the manuscript, but you can have really high resolution scans of the various manuscripts that you can compare along with comparatives of transcribed texts, any kind of scholarly annotations, and also various tools for comparison. So this digital Faust edition is being prepared for a really quite long time. It's a hybrid format because there is a printed edition, but there is also this online platform. And on the website, you can actually navigate to all of the archived Faust manuscripts and the early prints. And you can even see Goethe's handwritten pages alongside the transcription. So it's for all Faust lovers. There are also these Genesis visualizations, because I don't know if you know that, but between the first published edition of Faust and the last, it was almost 60 years. And there have been many steps in between. So this kind of genesis of Faust is something that can be really nicely grasped here. And so, of course, there is the text section, which is presenting you the curated reading text. You can click on any line to see all the various versions from the different drafts. And therefore, what you can see is that literally just watching the author's creative process unfolding. This is not something that you can do easily on an analog book format. So I think this is really, really fun. But to be able to do this sort of digital critical editions, what you need to do is text encoding, and TEI is short for Text Encoding Initiative, which is essentially a set of XML guidelines on how to encode literary and historical text. Now, XML is one of the earliest fields of digital humanities. It's been evolving since the 1980s, and basically it became the de facto standards in the humanities for text encoding. It's almost like a digital lingua franca for people who are dealing with texts. So it's good because when you use TEI, when you use the specific markup language, then what you can do is that you can, for example, mark up the structure of the text. So you can mark chapters, you can mark paragraphs or verses even, but you can also mark up editorial information, for example, corrections, deletions, footnotes, references. But you can also mark up separate words if you want to, or even endings. So it can go from literally concepts to actual grammatical differences. It is extremely complicated, and some people think that it can be tedious as well, but it's absolutely worth it, because TEI is the one that ensures the kind of future-proof and interoperability of digital texts. What is also really important, that once your text is TEI encoded, so you have all these markups on a text, then you can use it in collaborative research. So this is very widely used. And then you can share your texts and insights. Austria actually puts a really big emphasis on that. And for example, there is a project, which is an international collaborative project. It's really cool. It's called monasterium.net, where you have thousands of Latin documents marked up, and it's completely searchable. Because of course, anything that you mark up can be searched later on. And this is the power of TEI. So if we want to sum up digital scholarly editing, that what we can say is that it kind of marries this very traditional philological rigor with the power of databases and all that a web interface can provide. So this is the part which ensures that our textual heritage is not only preserved, but it's also accessible, and you can analyze it in quite user-friendly and very, very scholarly valid ways. Okay, let's move on. Any guesses on where we are here? There are a few words that point you to the direction. I especially mean databases. So The next really big branch of digital humanities is digital archives, and connected to the digital archives, cultural heritage projects. So what we have under this really quite, again, bigger umbrella is all that you can find in libraries, archives, museums, and making them available in digital form. There is one that I have left reference to where I took the screenshot from. This is called Europeana, which is one of the flagship European initiatives. It kind of functions as like a central portal to Europe's culture, online culture heritage. Now it has access to over 55 million digitized items. I let this sink in. 55 million digitized items. And it is really a variety of items. So you have medieval manuscripts, you have paintings, you have folk songs, but you even have such things as like broadcasts. What is really important is that it's not just 55 million, but it's also 4,000 culture institutions across Europe. What did we say about digital humanities? Collaborative and open. This is it, guys. And this is all available for you. Just think about it. Can you imagine that 40 years ago, not that long, we are still like citing major books from that period, which laid down the foundation of various disciplines. They couldn't dream about even a fraction of this information that we can get. And you can maybe often feel that we are getting more specialized and so on and so forth. But it's also because with this vast amount of information, you can just recognize way more than it was possible before. So I searched for Beethoven because I think it's really funny that if you search for his Ninth Symphony, then you can get results from archives in Germany, Austria, France, all over Europe on one website. And what is also important in DH is the outreach to public humanities. So for example, on this website, you can also find these thematic exhibitions and stories to engage more than just the scholarly communities. And just to mention briefly, the Austrian National Library also is taking part in these digitalizing initiatives. So for example, only from the ÖNB, you have more than 3.5 million digitized objects. And altogether in Anno, which is also a crazy standout project, it's a digital newspaper archive. There you have 27 million pages of historical newspapers digitized. So, you know, you can, for example, search for anything you want. Let's say mentions of an epidemic in Vienna from the early 20th century, or even if you want to work on something more cultural, then how a certain author's work, let's say Kafka's works, were received at a time. Now, when we are talking about Austrian digital humanities and databases, one must mention the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage, which is not only playing a key role in developing the infrastructure, but also in defining data standards. One of the key points here is the FAIR principles, which means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which applies to all of these databases. So what it means to you, all of you, is that we can see that our primary sources that we are used to work from as humanities people are increasingly online. So this is really important in preservation, but also in the democratization of knowledge, okay? Because this is much more easily accessible to a much wider range of people than it had ever been before. Okay, let's move on, because I want to leave you time for questions. this is, I think, one of the most fascinating projects that are going on in Austria right now. And of course, I'm biased. But I think it's also telling for the next branch. Can you guess? Hint, there's a map on the screen. Okay, so let's just move on. It is spatial humanities. The spatial term in humanities has been one of the, I think, one of the most important that has been happening recently. Why? Because we are humans and we exist in space. This kind of desire to map our environments is also not new. You can see these kind of studies from the 70s and even earlier onwards. But back then, what they were using were transparent paper and scissors and many, many things on top of each other. Nonetheless, when we had the spatial term, this is where it started again. People wanted to see what happens if they map their data, to visualize data, what they can perceive from the context if they map their data. So it started as a visualization. However, this is really much, much more, because place and space is not only something that you can mark on a map and then say, he was here, she was there, blah, blah, blah. But it's also something that you can analyze. So I always say to my students when I teach my classes about space is that we all exist in space. Everything that we are doing are happening in space. And we are influencing the space around us, but the space around us also affects us. Therefore, understanding the space in which any kind of historical humanities, whatever processes took place, opens you up a third dimension in your research, a third dimension that is very, very often quite under-researched, simply because up until the latest geographical information system developments, so GIS, it was simply not really possible. You could go for the visualization, but the analysis was not possible. So one of these projects that I brought up, Thanatos, is the anthropological and archaeological database of sepulchres. It's collecting all the published burials from the early medieval times from the area of Austria. And how one of my colleagues are calling it, they're calling it medieval Tinder. Because what you can do is you can go from the level of various sites. You can, of course, compare various cemeteries if you want to. You can contextualize it into space. But you can also go down to the level of the individual and what the individual have on themselves. So, for example, you can say that you are a 9th century Corinthian man and you're looking for a wife, but you want it to be a good Christian. So you want to find yourself a woman who is also buried in a churchyard, and you want like a nice, lovely lady in their 20s, which you can also set up, who has certain like earrings because you want them to be rich. And then you can match up and figure out these patterns that are happening between places and within places, but also across them. One of the projects that we are doing is also based on that. That's my research, which is bringing this a little bit forward. What we do is we go back to Moratti's principles of distant reading and close reading, just in space. So what we want to see is how the everyday people participated in really large processes like Christianization or state formation. So we contextualize them into the physical and political landscape. And once that is done, we are doing a close reading and we are comparing these very little individual differences like burial customs on a personal level within sites and across sites. So this can go very far from, just mapping locations of, for example, wells, which was one of the first attempts for this. John Snow's cholera map. Look it up. It's very fun. I also brought you one project, which I will just briefly mention, which is the interactive music mapping in Vienna, which was actually checking, for example, the concentration of jazz venues in post-World War II districts in Vienna. So it wanted to see, for example, how the state theaters and the independent music spaces were distributed to kind of see how music shapes the urban environment. Now, I'm not gonna talk much more about this, but what is really important is that spatial humanities considers place as data. And never ever forget that this data is the third dimension, okay? So whenever you think about a historical problem, a humanities problem, space is the one that most often escapes your mind. But I would like to encourage you to not do that, but to go there with your imagination and see how that goes. Now, the last one in the in this branches of digital humanities, can you guess what this might be? Yeah?
Maybe that's also analyzing the fiction, analyzing the content of the actual text.
Very good. So your colleague have recognized that we have these characters from Game of Thrones, and we are seeing also the relationships between them. And this is what we call network analysis in digital humanities. Network analysis is another really, really powerful method. What we see here that we have nodes, which are the characters in this case, and their relationships, which are edges. And then we use graph theory to analyze the structure. So what is important is that you can use this in like humanities as elements. So it can be people, but it can be also other entities, as you have said. So for example, texts connected by citations, concepts or co-occurrences, and so on and so forth. What are the relations are defined by us? What are the nodes are also defined by us? I brought you an example, the project of the 6 degrees of Francis Bacon, which is collecting 13,000 people from the 16th and 17th centuries, which is already crazy. Like, we would never be able to do this without computers. But when you also realize that it also enlightens more than 200,000 social connections between these people, and you can analyze these social connections, then you can even more understand the power that you can see in social network analysis. There's also a fun little thing, and if you check Shakespeare, he was very close to politicians, like one person in between them, that no other source kind of exposes directly. So you can see these kind of things that are appearing in the social network analysis, which you would not see before. So what you see is kind of a mix of automated text mining, but also human scholarship, because of course, as I said, we are the ones who decide on the nature of relationships. Now, if we want to kind of point out a bit more of what is network analysis in DH, then what we can say is not limited, of course, to biography or to history. So you can use it in literary studies and explore the character networks, as we have said. But for example, you could also use it in intellectual history, in trying to follow the transmission of ideas, intellectual history, philosophy, and so on and so forth. Or there is another thing that you could use, for example, in literary history, which is word adjacency networks. So you can analyze the connecting words that frequently appear to each other. And this would help you kind of visualize themes or some sort of semantic structure of a book. So the general benefit is that any kind of analysis of networks is going to enable us to handle complex relational data, both in a visual way and in a quantitative way. Okay, so we can visualize it, but we can also get the statistical interpretation of it as well. What is also important is that this is inherently interdisciplinary. So this sort of network analysis very often include participants from multiple disciplines. For example, you mix historians and literary scholars, computational experts, and so on and so forth. This is because they need to source the data, then model it, and then run algorithms to find the shortest path between these nodes. Now, this is not always can be restricted to the expertise of one person. One of the very nice examples for this is the mapping the Republic of Letters, which is basically plotting thousands of letter exchange during the Enlightenment, then maps it and creates these network graphs between the intellectuals of this super exciting period. Also adding some of the transmission of ideas. So what is important is that when you want to go into the dimension of relations, then it's network analysis that is going to help you bring this out. So now, if we want to kind of sum all of this up, then what we can say is that one keyword that we can see here is scale. As digital humanity is evolving, one of the most important thing is big data and the distant reading in all of these branches of big data. I think it's also kind of visible now that these fields are not completely individual, right? You can use various kinds of data in these different fields, bring experts together and examine it from different angles. They are not necessarily working alone. Therefore, this sort of growing data is something that is only going to multiply in the future. This is also something that is called the datafication of culture, which means that many aspects of the humanities that were qualitative are now also encoded in databases, which really offers us all of these exciting possibilities and new questions. So, for example, can we track the evolution of a narrative forms over 10,000 novels? But it also challenges us to maintain these interpretative nuances because numbers are not the same as understanding. Big data is really cool, but there is one thing that I always tell my students: if you do digital humanities, you're only going to be good at it as you're good at your humanities part, because you are the one who needs to ask the questions. If you can't ask the questions, it doesn't matter what a tech whiz you are, it's not going to matter because you don't have the humanities understanding of the factor. And I think this is maybe some point where we can talk a little bit, just mentioning AI. Of course, it's very controversial because there's a huge potential in AI and machine learning, but at the same time, also it questions our own existence in some ways, that the more AI can do, the more you think that we are not needed so much. But of course, this is not quite true. It comes with all sorts of challenges because, of course, if the AI can produce the analysis, then what can we do? But we know that the AI is at least not yet on the level that it can understand the humanities problems on a level that it can prompt the questions. So it's still in our hands. And while that is, I think it is really another tool that can potentially enhance the way that we are dealing with big data and digital humanities. Nonetheless, I think it is also a stark reminder that humanistic values, and especially critical thinking, is actually much more needed now than ever because of this information flood that we are living in. You need to be able to tell the differences, okay? You need to be able to recognize what is human-made and what is AI-made. Okay. And one more thing is that digital humanities is not something that is still. It's constantly developing. So what an exciting time to be in for you, to be right in the middle of that. I really hope that you're going to take advantage of that. And just saying that, I want to point your attention on the Masterstudium in Digital Humanities. I have the basics up here, but what I want to say is that if you're interested in digital humanities and you think that it would be something that might be cool for you, then I suggest you come for our info event this Friday, which is going to be on seminar round 4 here in the Hauptgebäude from 2 p.m. onwards, where you can learn more about the people who work at digital humanities and more about the curricula. That's about it for me. Thank you for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions.
Sorry. Yeah. This should, yeah.
Oh, sorry, it's working with it. Yes. Thank you for a lecture on this fascinating topic. I wanted to ask, you said that digital humanities always develops. What would you say is sort of the next step? What is something that, for example, right now digital humanities can do, but will learn to do in foreseeable future?
So you can always track this by the hiring processes of the university. We are in the process of hiring a new AI professor for AI. So that is definitely one of the major areas of the future. And I might be biased because, as I said, that what I do is spatial humanities, but I really think that we have a lot to expect from that field too, simply because it is a bit lagging behind, for example, text analysis, which has a much longer history. Spatial history and spatial analysis in the humanities field was very often kind of restricted to archaeology or very closely archaeology related studies other than geography and historical geography. So I think this is also a field where once we get like a better understanding, it can be much more common, and there's a lot to discover from there. So come to my classes, guys.
Perhaps it's important to add on this point that the students here are in their first term in the BA. So read the last point. If you want to study these MA Digital Humanities studies, you have to do this Erweiterungskurriculum in your BA, and then you have the chance to go there. Because they are still a little bit far away from the MA, but there is this how to use the BA studies already for digital humanities. And would it be possible for them to come also on Friday to learn something about the Erweiterungskurriculum?
Absolutely. Everybody is welcome. It's not only for advanced BA students, but it's for everybody who's interested in digital humanities. It's a kind of an informal event. We want to make digital humanities less scary.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Could you envision maybe in the future that people who are getting these master studies maybe can work as something in the future, yeah, as a kind of police who are identifying all texts that were generated by IA, or maybe somebody invented this story. Maybe kind of check if this is real or not?
This is a really exciting idea. I would love um, if political entities would give money for this. And I think that the only obstacle for this is that, right? Because it's about educating people. And the question is that how the governments, how important the governments think it is to educate people. And once they think it is important enough, I absolutely can imagine that this would happen. Because as you see, for example, there was kind of a slow progress also on like online harassment and so on and so forth. But even if you might not be super successful if you go to such a claim with such a claim to the police, but they are not going to dismiss you. So I don't think that this is going to be a rapid process, but this is a really interesting idea, and I hope that it is going to go in that direction. But I think, unfortunately, this part is not on us academics, but it's on the politicians and their need to recognize that people are better if they are not governed by the information that is coming from AI. Of course, that is kind of a paradox because it depends on what kind of politicians you're talking about. So if you think about these populistic tendencies, they are using this. So it's never going to be in their interest to set up something like that. But I always have hopes for a brighter future.
Oh my goodness. I think my question is fits pretty well the question before it. I don't want to disregard tech optimism because I think it's a very constructive approach to technology, but how is digital humanities, how is the academic field dealing with the problem that tech can not only be used for good, but can also be used for evil? How, for example, some practical examples would be, is digital humanities, is there a critical discourse towards the topic of climate change? Is there a critical discourse towards the topic of how AI, for example, is used in war practices? And in what ways is this also affecting politics?
There is absolutely discussions on this. I just think that it's not necessarily restricted to digital humanities because of course you need some sort of an understanding of how tech works, but not really to understand these processes. So I see this as more of a humanities issue than necessarily only a digital humanities issue, but there are absolutely discussions going on that way. For example, climate change, just to reflect on that one, that is one really awesome example because also of the ongoing research on historical data sets on historical climate changes and the comparison of what is happening today, but also the discovery of coping mechanisms. So we can actually reach back to the past to get a better future when it comes to climate change. There's a lot of research going on that direction. And that is the more digital humanities version part or digital climate research part. I think when it comes to the abuse of social media and AI and so on and so forth, it's part digital humanities, but I feel like that is still more on the humanities side.
Further questions? I don't see anyone. Yeah.
Thanks for your answer. That was very interesting and informative. And it also inspired me to have like a further leading question, which would be, you said that the politicians have to educate people on how to act with AI, on their relationship with AI, on rules and regulations and stuff. But isn't there also a responsibility on academics to influence politicians in a way, especially with when we're looking at the USA at the moment, when technicians that are very into anti-intellectualism.
Absolutely. I don't think that politicians need to educate, but they need to give the money for education for us to be able to do that. But of course we have to. Why do you think I'm saying that? Education is power.
There, I don't see any. There's another question.
Thank you. I'm a little bit ashamed because I'm really young, but I'm really not a digital native. I'm not feeling like this. So maybe this question is a little bit stupid, but I would be interested in what are the problems in a epistemological way, because first you mentioned like statistics, and I have the feeling, okay, it's just a statistic that is done with technological instruments and not by hand. So the question about knowledge is the same. But are there coming some new impulse for this broader discussion, what knowledge is from your discipline right now? This would be my question.
I hope I understand this rightly. But it's not at all a dumb question. This is very interesting. And I think, yes, of course, because I think this question comes ultimately back to the point which I made about digital humanities is humanities. In its core, it's humanities. And therefore, we can say that, yeah, there is statistics, there is this and that, and da da da. But do you think that humanities is static? Do you think that the questions that we ask or the way we approach things is static? I don't think so. And because humanities is ultimately the motor that is pushing digital humanities forward, I think that it is going to evolve, and it is going to evolve influenced by many, many things, not, by the way, completely independent from what we can expect from big data and AI and tools and methodologies coming up that way. Actually, one more thing that I think that will be very interesting to watch is the advancement in intellectual history. So in tracing the history of ideas, which is really, really hard to do by machine learning, for example, or really hard to do it in big data, because people may take an idea from someone else. So for example, I'll give you an example. There is a guy in the 12th century called Gkg Vo, who is talking about the third age, which is the age of the Holy Spirit. And then you find these ideas in the writings of Comenius, who is in the 17th century. And you need to find the intermediaries between them. How do you do that? There won't be any exact phrasings. You can't mark this up in TEI exactly. So there are kind of already ways and means to do that. But I think with the evolving methodology, with the growing number of digitized data sets, these are the kind of more nuanced things where we can expect more, both in terms of methodological evolvement and our approaches coming differently, if that makes sense.
Also, my English is not so good. And now I understood you, like that you're saying there are new perspectives and there are new Inhalte that you can focus on it. But my question more referred to okay. If with the new methods, there are also coming new concept of truth and what this impact have to general discussions about truth, and not that in this way from fake news, because I know they're fake, but in like how to construct reality and
I would have.
I think this is a very interesting but very difficult question. I'm not sure we have time for a complete discussion on this, but what I have to say is that I don't think that you think that there is an objective truth. So since there is no objective truth, then of course our perspective on it changes all the time. And the different kind of answers that we can get from this more information, the processing of more information is going to differ, but it's not going to be an objective truth. It's just going to be different versions of it.
Any further questions? If not, I would like to go a little bit further on this point regarding this objectivity and the question of truth, or maybe let us call it objectivity because it fits more to this to humanities and science than truth. Because there has been in philosophy and as well in history this big discussion and research at what did objectivity mean in different countries, different and different disciplines. And I would like to be a little bit provocative in this moment to ask whether the big data, the technological possibilities, but also the technological necessities, because you need a big machine, you need people who know who are informed in informatics, and you need maybe more resources than other methods in humanities need. And in a way, this is a technological way of doing something like results, which seem to be true because or objective because they are made by technologies, but not by humans. And my question is, how far does this discussion of this philosophical discussion of what does knowledge in this academic context mean? How far is it included in this digital humanities sphere?
I think it's absolutely included. And I myself think that that's why distant reading cannot exist without a close reading. So nonetheless, it is very important. So if I can give you an example from my own research project, what we are doing is that we are trying to research the Christianization of Central Eastern Europe, so the people on the peripheries of the later Holy Roman Empire in the, let's say, 10th to 12th centuries continuously. Now, what we know from close reading and from traditional data is chronicles, some charters, all of them talking about the elite and the major institutions. So where are the people, right? Where is the majority of the society? This is what we are doing. We are collecting this big data, archival data, mostly archaeological, but not only, on all of the peoples of these areas to see, contextualize them politically, spatially, and so on and so forth, to see how the narrative, the patterns that we can gain from this contradict or not all of those that we are knowing from this distant reading, from this close reading of the sources about the elite. So I think this is a discussion that absolutely exists. And I don't think that distant reading is kind of a necessary evil or something like that. I think it is also something that can give us an understanding of things that were not available before. But doing only that, of course, is difficult without understanding the context of the close reading.
I would agree that because close reading in a way could be biased as well, of course, and absolutely. And we know that language plays a very antagonistic, no, not no, a very difficult, difficult role. Yeah. Perhaps one last question regarding AI, because of course this is something we are all fascinated with. Some of us are already working with it, and nobody knows what will be and whether what is possible and what not. And I would like to add something to your question, which you asked some minutes before, because I think we already know that AI is very biased, and that it confirms and that it not only confirms but also strengthens prejudices in the world, not only in one very small community, but because of this international possibilities and this technical connections, it is able to strengthen prejudices, biases, racist, sexist ideas of what makes the world go on. And I know that there is research how humans can teach AI to dislearn these biases, but nevertheless, isn't it also are these technological possibilities not more than only tools? Can they be dangerous in a way as itself?
I think we have to differentiate between these large language models like ChatGPT and so on, which can be absolutely dangerous, and we need to be very cautious on how we are using it or teaching it or de-teaching all of these kind of things, and between AI that we are actually using on selected sources. So machine learning and AI can be absolutely used only a corpus of sources that are our selection, and we can teach it of what sort of questions we want to ask and it to recognize it. I'm going to give you a very weird example. So for example, you can have a LiDAR data set of entire Europe, and you want to LiDAR, so it's a laser-borne imagery thing, which checks the surface without vegetation. So you can recognize kind of features on the ground. And let's say you want to find a certain type of castles or whatever, remains, whatever you want. And then you teach AI how to recognize that. Because it's an insane amount of data. It's super big. You can't process it in any other way. But it's a very strictly selected data corpus on which you taught AI how to recognize it, and then it gives you the data. There is no harm in that. Of course, you have to check it because there can be like things that are misinterpreted or something like that. But at the same time, it can't give you this sort of dangerous outputs, right? If it's one of these large language models like ChatGPT or those that are used in a more common setting, then it's an entirely different discussion.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't see anyone. I don't see a finger anymore. So then thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for this really inspiring presentation. I'm really fascinated by the possibilities of digital humanities, and we will have about 15 minutes break. It could, yeah, and then we will have the next presentation. 15 minutes would be fine, I think, and then we start again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Okay, dann fangen wir an, oder? Okay, dann kommen wir jetzt zum zweiten Teil. Ich begrüße ganz herzlich Noémie Etienne zu unserer Vorlesung aus der Perspektive der Kunstgeschichte. Sie ist Kunsthistorikerin und hat ihre Professur am Fakultätszentrum für transdisziplinäre historisch-kulturwissenschaftliche Studien. Das heißt, ihre Perspektive auf die Kunstgeschichte geht auch über die Kunstgeschichte hinaus. Und sie hat also ihre Forschungsthemen umfassen sind aus einer globalen Perspektive auf die Frage von Restitutionen, auf die Frage von Bewahrung, Museum und Sammlung und auch auf die Frage der Konservierung gerichtet. Und sie wird, you will speak in English?
I think so.
Yeah, so we will switch to English again, but remember, you can ask in German or English. And this is no problem at all.
Vielen Dank. Es ist kein Problem. Nee, es ist lustig, weil mein Job war immer Professur für Cultural Heritage. Und es war ein bisschen like, okay, kann man das nicht anders nennen, Kulturerbe und so weiter. Aber die sagen, nein, nein, Cultural Heritage. Deswegen, ich habe jetzt ein bisschen diese bilinguale, ja, also bilinguale Tradition. Und ich spreche normalerweise Französisch, vielleicht kann man das auch hören. Deswegen, ich spreche auf Englisch, aber wie gesagt, ich kann gerne auf Deutsch sprechen. Ich habe viele Echos. Habt ihr auch oder nicht? Das ist nur, ich höre mich fast zweimal, aber kein Problem. Okay, nein, kein Problem. Ich schaffe es. Genau. So die Frage ist immer ein bisschen, so the question is a bit for you, also for me, to be honest, what is cultural heritage? It's a bit vague, it's a bit broad, we don't really know what it is. And there is not just one answer, but there are many people who have discussed it before. Maybe what I can say for myself is that I like it better than art, although I am an art historian, because I feel it's less loaded with ideology. It's in the sense that it's less about beauty, it's less about Europe, it's less about hierarchies, it's less about artists. I think it's a bit more interesting, or at least for me, because it's a bit more open and inclusive. It's also clear, I think, for all of you that, I don't know, medieval Gothic sculptures were not necessarily seen as art. So art is also a category that comes from the 18th century and that we can use, but also I personally don't feel always comfortable. Because also I wonder what is not art and who decides. But I will not tell you that now. I would just like to give you some introduction about the theories that we currently have agreed on, most of the scholars of the Bereich, cultural heritage. And it's to say, it's very broad, but I think it's necessarily broad. One of the things we say is that heritage is tangible. It's generally material, but it cannot be only tangible. So it cannot be, for instance, only a chair or only a building or only a painting. Heritage is a bit more than that. So we try to think, I say we, but it's a group of scholars. We try to think about how heritage can be material and how it can also be immaterial and how this can go together. So this is confusing at first. You think, but is it material or not? Can we choose? Do we have to choose? Is it exclusive? Yes, no. And the current state of the definition is to say that it's generally both, and it's necessarily intangible. So just to try to explain, we cannot say, for instance, that this is heritage, but if this has been used by Napoleon, or if this has been used by Alois Riegel, one of the big art historians of Vienna school, then yeah, who knows? Then this can become heritage. So it's not the thing, it's not the spray, it's the stories that goes with it. Who used it, who preserved it, who classified it as heritage, what goes with the spray. The spray is not enough. The spray is the beginning of the heritage process, but the spray is not the end. All of that, it's just one perspective. You will have people who will say, no, heritage is the national symbol of the nation. Well, it's a perspective as well. The perspective that scholars nowadays use is to say heritage is both tangible and intangible. It's a thing that goes with the story, and the story matters. The storytelling matters. And maybe you saw that, or you see that all the time if you read the newspaper, if you go to social media, the stories matter a lot. That's why we also do what we do. We try to understand the story better and to tell other stories if necessary. If I tell you this spray has been used by the most important art historian, you will keep this spray. But if I tell you this spray has been used by a cleaning person, you might not keep this spray. So the story matters a lot. And we do that. We tell those, I think, all of us, all historians, we try to, or I guess, we try to think about those stories and how to tell them. So I just took one classic example of the definition, and maybe you understand better what I mean, because I'm just actually explaining something that other people said before. Heritage is not the thing, site, or place. Rather, whole heritage is intangible, as it is the processes of meaning making that occur as heritage places or events are identified, denied, managed, exhibits, and visits or watched. So heritage, basically, the idea is that it's not just one thing. It's not just my spray. It's a process. It's a process in which I will or not classify this spray, keep this spray, exhibit this spray, or restore this spray, or just throw this spray away. And that is heritage making. Is that clear for everyone? What is the, and what I'm trying to do now is just to update you. If somebody asks you what is heritage, you say, well, heritage is not a thing, it's a process. Of course, it's both intangible and tangible. That's the state of the question. Just because everybody asks me. So I'm like, oh, it's a process. I'm just summarizing the story. A thing, a building, a tradition, it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. It doesn't really matter if it's beautiful, if it's big, if it's precious. It matters that it comes from a narrative. And this narrative is or isn't qualifying the thing as heritage. And it's also an established connection between a place, a people, and an object. And this is a bit repeating the argument. It's about the story we tell, and it's why it's so important, I think, to get to know, to consult archives, to see places, to talk to people. It's also to understand which stories are told and which stories are not told and why. And the last bullet point I choose for you is whose heritage? Because perhaps it's very obvious right now. If heritage is a story, or let's say if heritage is the process of telling stories with objects, it is also a choice. And not everything is classified as heritage. And when I was telling you, well, if I tell you that we keep the spray if Alois Riegel uses it, we don't keep it if a cleaning person uses it, what am I assuming? I'm assuming that the cleaning person is not important and that Alois Riegel is important. And therefore, I'm already making an assumption about hierarchies in the society. I'm telling the art historian I know is important. I know his name, and I tell you, the cleaning person has no importance. I don't keep this heritage. So here I'm stating the obvious. I hope and I think all of you have thought about that before. What is in a museum is not all what was there in the past. What you see in a museum is what people have decided to keep and to exhibit and to make it as heritage. And that's how it is, but that's also why we say heritage is a battleground. Heritage is contested. Heritage can be very problematic. Who decides the figures that are celebrated? And I think all of you know the Bürger monument. I didn't take it as an image today, but this is this monument to a mayor in the city of Vienna, who was exhibited without telling anything about the fact that he was actually strongly supporter of anti-Semitism. And yet he's there because he plays a political role, but the story is not entirely told, or part of the story are not told. And this has a meaning. We can decide we don't care, or we can decide, as I do, we care. We care about what is told and what is not told, who speaks and who's not speaking, and even more so, who's silenced. Because there are many, many, many stories that are not told, not just because we don't know, but because we don't want to know, or because we don't want to hear those stories. And I'm not talking about like a complot or anything that is like, it's not that, but there are, in each society, in each government, in each of us, there are also important hierarchies, there are values, there are agendas, there are all of that. And heritage is the product, not produce, is the product of that. Is that clear? What I'm stating really the obvious, but perhaps it's good just one to tell you. It's not about beauty, it's not about building, it's not about a cathedral. It's about what a group, a regime, a nation, a person, a museum wants to keep or not. And this is not neutral. Basic affirmation, but still needs to be said. And then I wanted to talk about, I always change, so I surprised Ditlin a little bit with what I'm talking about. I wanted to talk about another question that is related to that. And it's not only what is heritage. I think now you've got it. So if somebody asks you, remember heritage, it's a process, not a thing, not a thing. Where is heritage? And I think that's one of the questions we ask ourselves. Whose heritage is where, and where are things? I can just tell you an anecdote. Today, really this afternoon, I went to the Welt Museum to search for something, and the curator didn't know where the room of the storage was. He was just lost. It was so big to go in storages. He was like, okay, it's room number 2.10. Where is that? And he never found it. And then he had to call a guy. He says, there is so many objects and so many rooms. I don't know where I'm going with you. I don't know where the things are. It's just to give you an idea of how much things we have in our museums and in our storage. And I just also wanted to start with that. And I think many of you might have heard of that. It's already kind of old by our standards. It's from 2019, and it's a discussion about the restitution of objects. So it's also possible that for all of us, some heritage, even national heritage, is not perhaps in the country which has produced the heritage. And it's the case for many things. It's also the case in the history. I'm by training an 18th century art historian, and I know that under Napoleon Empire, a lot of things has been taken from Italy, a lot of things have been taken from Germany, a lot of things have been taken from Austria, and they have been brought to Paris. So objects circulate since a very long time. And yet some objects circulate more than others, and some culture have been perhaps more spoliated than others. And that's the point of departure of this report. Just to give to have a quick idea, who knows about that? Like, who knows what I'm talking about? And it's like, of course, this report. Are we thinking zero? No. No? So you've heard about the restitution debate a little bit, but maybe not about this report? Not necessarily. Okay. Yes, one person is nodding. So these two people, Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoie. She is professor for art history at the Technische Universität Berlin. And he is an economist based in the USA, but originally from Senegal. And they have been asked by the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, to do a report. You can download it, it's online, it's for free, you just like download. You don't even need to read everything, like you can read the beginning, it's enough. They have been asked to make proposition and give their opinion about the restitution of African heritage. So they did go to storages like the Weltmuseum, like the Musée du Quai Branly in France, like many, many museums in Germany, in Italy, in all Europe. And they concluded that 90% of African heritage is today in European museum, 90%. It's a lot. It's also very debated because if you talk to African colleagues, which I'm lucky to do quite regularly, they will tell you, but Noemi, you think our heritage is old status in wood? Don't want that. Well, our heritage is like dance, performances. We are very well, thank you, keep them. It's for tourists anyway. We don't care. But their perspective, it's also a political perspective, is quite different to say like a lot of objects have been spoliated. And that's true. And I guess you know that, right? In the 19th century, a lot of colonial projects of exploration, quote unquote, had different consequences. One of these consequences was the fact that objects have been spoliated. It happened many times. It happened in many countries. Germany spoliated things in Namibia during the genocide. The French empires, or just the French state, spoliated a lot of Africa when they had this very big empire as well. It's not a unique phenomenon, but it's a very, how should I say, a very predominant phenomenon. And there has been a lot of discussion about all of that and what should be done. And one thing that should be done, or one thing that is proposed, is to restitute objects. Maybe you've heard about that too, is to bring them back. And that opens a lot of questions. How do you bring things back? Where do you bring them back? Can you bring things to museum in Africa? And if so, where would you do that? Which museum would you? No worries. Which museum would you connect? How can you prove that the objects have been spoliated? How can you reconstitute this history? And also it's political. I mean, I think you should understand, maybe it's not something that is also so well explained in the reports, but it's the French president of France today who asked them to do this report. And what does he want? He wants to have new connection to Africa. He has lost his empire. He wants to have a better contact with African leaders. So he's like, I've got an idea. We're going to give them the stuff, and then we're going to have like contract for oil, for gas, for highways, and for more construction. It's the truth. It's the unfortunate truth. And on the other side, you have the African president of Benin. He says like, this is so great. I will show to my people that I get things done. I get the French to apologize and to bring the stuff back. Let's do this restitution. So very little people really care about these artifacts, but some people actually do. Some people cannot pray their ancestors. Some people cannot perform rituals. The spoliation and circulation of all this material has also a very big consequence. And I just show just a big bit of the report, and you can read it. I encourage you to read it if you have not had the chance. It's interesting, although it has been also quite debated for good reasons. To fall under the spell of an object, to be touched by it, moved emotionally by a piece of art in a museum, brought to tears of joy, to admire its form of ingenuity, to like the artwork's colors, to take a photo of it, to let oneself be transformed by it. All these experiences, which are also forms of access to knowledge, cannot simply be reserved to the inheritors of an asymmetrical history, so this is us, to the benefactors of an excess of privilege and mobility. So the question they ask is not only, okay, whose heritage is not there, whose heritage is not preserved, but also who has access? Why is it me who goes this afternoon in the storage at the Weltmuseum to show objects that the curator didn't even find because they have so many? You're like, oh, I don't know this room. I've never been actually. You're like, but I mean, it was a great moment. I really thank this curator for doing that. And he really took out of his time, but it also shows some people are allowed to go and some people are allowed to access and some people are allowed to consult when they even find it. And other people are not privileged enough. And this speaks about inheritors of an asymmetrical history. And this also shows about how much politics is involved in everything, but definitely in heritage management. Who cares and what is cared for? So if I still have a little bit of time, yes. I wanted to just show you a couple of images about museums in Africa. And I was just like thinking that maybe a map of Africa would not be bad, and show you some images from Senegal. You have to imagine, I think it's crazy for us today, but the French Empire went from Senegal, Dakar, to Djibouti, basically, Ethiopia. So the other way, that was the French Empire. It's like huge. It's unbelievably huge. And they possessed it for some time. Had to let it go, unfortunately for them. But it's really a complex history where there are a lot of layers, and it's not possible, I guess, when you do heritage studies to just go and say, oh, I love African arts, it's so beautiful. There are questions about where the things are coming from and where they are going. I'll take us a bit of time, but also not too much. Just I wanted to show some typologies, because a big thing is also about, okay, if we restitute these objects, where would they go? And do these people have museums? And a lot of the argument I hear, or I used to hear, is like, well, but anyway, they have nowhere to put the stuff. So we better keep it, because at least we have the storages. So I just went to Senegal with my colleague not long ago, and I wanted to propose very quickly a typology of museums somehow that we could observe. So it's true, until a large extent, that the tradition of museums is not a Senegalese tradition. They didn't have museums before the colonization. They didn't want them, and they still don't really want them. But today, they have anyway some buildings. So one thing is the reuse of historical building. Generally, it's colonial building, and here you see a fortress, which used to be a fortress, which was at some point also a jail. So it's interesting also that a fortress can become a jail and can become a museum. I think if you think about the space, this is what we do in art history, we think about the space. So basically it's the same space, a big corridor and rooms, and you put stuff or people inside. So there is a kind of flexibility of the building. And it has been reopened recently, more or less recently, as a museum. It used to be there was another building that was a museum of French West Africa, and then after the independence of Senegal, it has been reopened as a museum. Just also for you to remember, if you don't know, the African independences are in the 60s, 1960s. Sometimes we know that, sometimes we forget. And if you have time and want to watch a movie that is cool, I recommend two actually. One is called Soundtrack for Coup d'Etat. Maybe somebody has seen that. It's good. It tells you a lot about the independence of different countries in Africa. I say it again. It's available on Arte for free. Soundtrack of a Coup d'Etat. And the other that you will find is called Dahomey, and it was the Golden Lion at the Berlinale. Dahomey, like the region in Benin. It's made by a German Senegalese whose name is Mati Diop. Yes. I cannot, under that, okay. So Dahomey, it was the name of Benin. It's really nice. And Soundtrack for Coup d'Etat, I just write soundtrack. Soundtrack for a Coup d'Etat. This is on Arte. Watch it, it's cool. And Dahomey also, nice. So that's one of the building, that's one of the typology. And maybe one thing to say is that there are 500 objects in the museum. I show you the rooms. 500 objects, it's very little. I don't know much museum who have 500 objects. maybe like super small private museum. I don't know how many in the vet museum, but like 500,000 maybe. So it's very little. And that's one of the problem. I mean, so you see what is exhibited, it's like photographed, there are some archaeological stuff, some artworks made on purpose for the museum, very little material. And it's also one of the difficulty is that this is not there anymore. It's all in Paris. And we have it in storages, which is not very visible. Another example I just wanted to show you, it's also a colonial building, and it's in Dakar. So this is the central city, capital city of Senegal. And they reused buildings that were made by the colonial administration, like in that case, the French administration. It's actually quite beautiful building if you like the architecture of the fortress. And they have big collection in there, and this collection have all been brought there by the French. It's not a museum that the Senegalese people did by themselves. It's a museum that the colonial administration did. And then when they left, they were like, well, we have it, so why don't we do a museum as well? But quite nobody wants to go inside. People are not that interested to go in those places, in fact. So they try, and this is what I'm trying to show you in the image, they try to make it, and I think it's an interesting thing we can also think about. They try to make it lively, and they put like a nice place. If you want to stay just on the stairs, you just sit down, and that's also fine. They put cushion on the floor. They try to make it like a bit nice for the people. But you still have to pay an entrance fee. You still have to want to go. And honestly, it's not the case for everyone. You can see some of my team in that photo. And again here, and another thing that they try to do, and I think it's interesting, is to make it nice to be outside, because they are like, okay, well, nobody wants to come inside Zovizo. So why don't we arrange structure so people can just not pay, be outside and meet and talk? And maybe that's better. Maybe that's culture, actually. And I think it's all interesting approaches to what a museum can be. Maybe it should also be something quite different. So they constructed in the garden that is surrounding the building this nice structure, and we used it, and everybody can use it. And it's way more visited than the museum itself. I'll just pass that, but maybe I can just say one word. It's that this is the museum, and this is something I saw in the streets. And the point and why the people don't want to come is also because all these things and arts, as we call them, or heritage, they were not meant to be in a museum. So this is a cloth. This is completely tied up. They put it in a pedestal. They try to exhibit it in a white box. But the real thing is, if you go in the street from St. Louis, which is another city nearby, the things they are in the street like that, and they are made to be used, and they are made to be degraded. They don't really care if it stays forever or not. And the museum concept is not entirely satisfying for them. As past that, another kind of place is again a very colonial building that is reused as a museum. Sometimes there are collections, and sometimes there are no collection. And here I show you the storages. So maybe you know what a storage is. It's, keep talking about storages. It's the thing outside or beyond the museum that you don't see. And you can see very expensive storages. This is like storages in Europe, but we are in St. Louis, which is almost a desert. And they received a lot of money to do that, to do like European standards. And maybe you see, but the storage is empty again. So it's a bit of a dramatic situation where they kind of try to meet up by European standards to have their object back, and they wait for the object to come back, and they say, look, we can take care of them. And there is AC in that storage, for instance, but we are in the desert. There is not AC in the hospital. But they have AC there, and they are like excited about what could come, and nothing come. So the situation is a bit dramatic. They try to meet up the standards, and yet things are not restituted, because they will not be restituted except if there is a big agreement between the president of Senegal and France, which will not be the case because the president of Senegal is not really friendly to the French. I'll show you two other examples, and then I stop. This is a bit like a library. This is a bit like an artothèque. Maybe you know that. It's a museum and it's in Cameroon when you can have the object on loan. So for instance, I used this spray in my family forever, but I put it in the museum for like 1 year. And when I need a spray, I come and I take it again. So they make it like a place where you can circulate from different perspectives. So you can come and let the stuff, use them at your place, and then bring them back. And maybe the last point I wanted to show you is the new kind of project, because there are a lot of investment in Africa, and they try, many people, many foundations, also European, American, try to invest or want to invest. Generally, they want to invest because they want to have also other compensation for this investment, which is like big treaties for building bridges or roads. And they finance very often big museums that people want to construct. And I show you another example. But all these museums have a long and difficult time to really develop, and all of them are in the agenda. The money is there, the resources are there, but the museum is not there. Maybe just to conclude, two things I wanted to say. That's a performance in the street in Benin. And that's what it's meant to be, things. It's not meant to be in a museum. It's not meant to be tied up. It's not meant to be in a storage. It's meant to be activated. I don't want to enter the big history beyond the image and what it is exactly. It's a police. It's a secret society where you have to dress up to do justice in full discretion. It doesn't look very discreet to us, but it's a way the people are not recognizable. So this is what it is. This is what it is, heritage. They fully dress up. They perform the ritual, and if, for instance, I have stolen this spray, everybody knows I have stolen it, but the justice say, no, Frau Etienne, no, she has done nothing. Well, these people, this secret community, they come at night and they take the spray back. So it's a police. It's a very, very efficient police, and this is how they are dressed up. And this is heritage for them, and it's quite efficient, and it's made for being activated. It's made for sound, it's made for motion, it's made for performances, it's made for dances, it's made for police, actually. So the concept of the museum is very complex also to export. That's one of the issue. And the other issue I just wanted, but it's a long quotation, maybe I'll just sum up part of it. It comes from an architect, so she's not a historian, but she writes that because she's asked to construct a museum in Africa. She asked, well, the museum as we understand it today, with its collection and accumulation over the globe, was part of an age of empire and plunder. This immediately makes it irrelevant outside the imperial context. I've, I think, spoken to a lot of people who are struggling with the notion of the museum, whether it's NGOs or other institutions who make museums in Africa. They complain that nobody visits them, that they stay empty, gathering dust, not care for it. And I'm not going to continue, but just to sum up, what I wanted to tell you today is that heritage is very complex. It's a lot of politics. Who decide what is kept? Who decide how it's kept? Who decide where it's kept? And if we interrogate that, we sort of unfold the stories about the building, stories about colonization, stories about the empire, stories about people, stories about objects themselves. You can unfold many stories if you take as a starting point the question of their conservation, circulation, and existence as heritage. So it's a field where you connect, I think, politics and micro cases somehow. And I will just stop now so you don't have too much. And of course we can talk or in German or English. Are we good with like that? Yeah. And then or we can not talk, you prefer. Or wie ihr wollt, wie Sie wollen. Wollt ihr? Ja. Ich weiß nicht, wollen wir diskutieren? Willst du das machen? Du. Wer put you that image? Sonst weißt du was? Ich kann das.
Das ist jetzt alles klar. So, Fragen? Da hinten. Ja.
Die kennen die Report, right? Du bist die sind die, ja. Okay, okay. Okay, es ist interessant.
I wanted to ask not about the Restitutions report right now, but in Geschichtswissenschaften haben wir uns auch mit Plätzen beschäftigt, and with the cultural heritage of specific Orten. How does studying this kind of subject and how does doing the research impact your own relationship with the culture, with your own cultural heritage and the cultural heritages that you come in contact with?
You mean it's a personal question, a bit, or you? Okay, no, okay. I don't know. It's very. I think something I can say first is that I personally studied art history and did a PhD between France and Geneva, Switzerland. Never did I heard about Africa entirely ever. It was not part. Although I studied with somebody who does cultural heritage, they never talked about it because I think they don't consider it as, I don't know, heritage. But and I'm not an expert, but what I've been doing is that I travel when I can, and it's a big luxury. Also, we can debate how good it is, and I talk to people and I observe things and I try to understand and put it in my perspective. So I think it's changing us, but I think this is why we do research. It's changing us. It's challenging us and it's changing us. And sometimes we also challenge others. And we ask ourselves, why nobody speaks to me about Africa when I'm in the capital of the empire for my PhD? It's like,
And thank you. I really enjoyed following you. And I have a question because you told this story of a talk with a colleague that say, no, you can just keep this stuff. We are not interested in this. And I have a question if you could talk more about this process that like the colonial or the imperialistic societies define something as a heritage that maybe in the context where it's produced doesn't have this symbolic, it doesn't have this process to become a heritage, and how this also I thought this is also violence that fixate or essentiates something, and how the discussions are about like also from a decolonial perspective, how to, when you say we want to have back this heritage that was, but the process was a violent process. Yeah.
I recommend you again this movie from Mati Diop because she's an artist, so it's an artistic film, but she films all the restitution from the perspective of the status, like the objects. So she put her camera in the objects and the camera look at everything. So it's about also non-human perspective on the heritage process. And she really put emphasis on the French expectation, because each time the Benin colleague touched something or approached, all the French are like, will they do it well? Will they have the good gloves? Will they, like, they do it very well, but they do it in the French way. So that's a big issue. It's very complex. Maybe one thing to be said about this report, and I really like and know the author, and they wanted to do good and say heritage has been stolen, this is bad. But as you said, they projected a specific notion of heritage, namely wooden status. And they didn't, it's okay that they didn't, it's fine. It's better because they can go toward restitution. But they wanted to be so decolonial that they didn't decolonize their own notion. No, and we can all do that. I mean, I do that all the time. It's a process for a lot of us too. What did I say? Was I colonial without even knowing? And they did. They were like, oh, it has been stolen. But when you talk to African people, not all of them, but most of them are like, this notion of heritage, the way you see it, we're not interested. Why? It is your discussion. But who is interested? It's the politician, both sides, because the African politicians are not stupid. They know French will like come and they will give back and they will apologize, and it's a big victory. I don't know how much it answers, but I understand your question. I think it's a thing we need to do, all of us, when we do research or writing. Ask ourselves, what am I exactly doing? Am I really seeing the complexity, or am I just, again, blind to a blind spot? Long process.
And I have another question. If the term heritage is a Eurocentric term, or is it something universal?
Yeah.
Or-
So in French, we don't say heritage, we say patrimoine, which is terrible term, which means the pater comes from the father, or the patrie, the nation. So in France, it's like horrible. You say rapatriation, restitution of patrimoine, like it's all to the mill, always. So now people say matrimoine, like, well, there are so different heritage, you know. I don't think heritage is maybe why they didn't translate it in my job. It's accepted. An African colleague will talk about heritage. They will even talk about patrimoine. It's just what they mean might be something different, a little bit different, not entirely. But yeah.
More questions? Not in the moment. Perhaps I may add something regarding these terms, because I think this is a very important discussion, and it's really a problem because to develop post-colonial discourse as well is something. You have all these terms which are which are cultural heritages of colonial systems as well. So how to do how to deal more in a more wie heißt es?
Respectful
and more gegenseitig
yeah, inclusive or
inclusive or something, and to use different languages, or to try to find languages which can work for both sides. What it means more translation in both directions, but yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a big question. I can show you something. It's a project
Yeah.
we're doing. It's not finished, so we don't share it. But we're trying to do a lot on the vocabulary, and we're trying to get people to define themselves. For instance, this is an image I show with their own words, and it's great, but it's also very complicated. There are a lot of words. First of all, it's languages we don't speak. I mean, who speaks Diola? I mean, in Europe, very little people. And then it's also very specific. They have sometimes categories, but sometimes it's really about one specific textile that has a specific name. So it's I don't know the answer. I just can tell, and sometimes you have even problem to write it, you know, because we don't.
Yeah.
So it's like in fact, if you really try to engage, which we are trying to do, I think it's almost like impossible.
Yeah.
It's a never-ending process.
Yeah.
And with so many complexity, and I don't speak the language, and I do the interview, but at the end, the person said, "Okay, I will tell you in French because I think you let it go." And they say, "We also speak French. It's not a problem. We are multiple." So we are like, "No, but I would like the." They're like, "Oh, give me a break." So our own will for authenticity somehow is our own, and nevertheless, we collect. We are trying, and we are working, of course, with people we know and that are part of the project to name everything. But then you end up with that pour feu, and I can tell you it's the throne of a king. I know that because I've worked on it, but it's very complex. What I can say is that we can still talk together. It's not necessarily an It's an infinite process of translation and discussion, but we can talk together. And African people, Africa and France, whatever we think about this relation, it's a long relationship. We've been to Africa, they've been to France. It's a long relationship, and we can speak together. We just have to interrogate our premises. But I think that's research. You have premises, and you kind of interrogate them. And when others have premises, you say, don't left your premises unquestioned. And that's why also research is a bit annoying sometimes, because we keep questioning everything. So it's like, but it's also the scientific person. So I don't have an answer. I know just like, and here this is Africa, but we work with Hobby that you also know from the Pacific. And it's completely other languages, completely other logic, completely other thinking about everything. And perhaps just to tell you some anecdote, I was like, okay, bring us an image for that. And she was like, no way I bring you an image for that. And I was like, oh, but the ERC, which is funding me, wants everything open data. We need to put it on open data. And she was like, no way I put it on open data. But I was like, it's science. She's like, oh no, it's colonialism. And I was like, oh, okay. So we discuss all the time. I just put an image for the pleasure.
More questions? Are you already planning to do research in cultural heritage?
I mean, I think all of us, we do research in
a way, yeah.
In a way. Whatever is important is to do research.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. And to have fun in it, because it's kind of fun. Sometimes we forget. And it's more fun when you talk to people.
More questions? If there are no more questions,
I wish you a good evening.
Yeah.
And I see you soon.
Yeah. Then we will stop here, and thank you, Noemi, for coming and presenting your very inspiring research and these difficult questions. And yeah, we will meet next week with the last presentation, not presentations, but we will repeat all this stuff of the lessons, and you have the chance for last questions regarding the exam in the end.
Soll ich